Hi everyone, my name is Jessica. I'm your TA for Language and Computers, and today I will be giving you the introductory lecture to our lesson in forensic linguistics. This is going to be a super fun lecture. For those of you who are interested in true crime, we're going to be going over several case studies in which forensic linguistics has been used in criminal investigation and also for further research purposes. This is also going to go hand in hand with our lecture in classification from last week. So with that all being said, let's go ahead and get started. So first of all, what is forensic linguistics? We can find forensic linguistics is using a text as training data in order to identify an author of a certain text. This has a wide range of applicability, from criminal investigation, like I mentioned earlier, to checking a paper for plagiarism, and so much more in between. So let's go ahead and look at one of the case studies for this. This is the Federalist Papers. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Federalist Papers, they were 85 articles sent to persuade New York to ratify the U.S. Constitution. These were written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. But the ones that are most important for this case study are Hamilton and Madison. So we have 12 essays from the 85 who we are uncertain who the author is, whether it's Hamilton or Madison. Our job as linguists is to help these historians is to determine which is more likely to have written which essay. This is tremendously helpful for historical and research purposes. But here's the question, how do we do that? The way that we are able to identify certain authors of a text is known as stylometry. We define and measure the features of an author's style, known as their idiolect, how they use words, which words they use most often, the speed at which they speak, etc., in order to create a linguistic fingerprint that can be better used to identify them. Now, this is far from a foolproof process, and we'll go into depth on what some of these problems are, but it does give us a better idea, and it gives us a certain level of probability that can significantly help us in identifying a certain author of a text or a certain speaker of an utterance. So, what are some of the problems with linguistic fingerprinting? One of them is that language is constantly growing and evolving, so we constantly have to shift our data set in order to see what this person speaks like in the modern day, or in whatever time period we are trying to identify. Another thing is that we don't speak the same in different environments in which we are in. So think about when you know you're being recorded. If you know that you're being recorded, you're likely going to speak in a different way. This is known as the observer's paradox, but there are also many different environments in which we speak differently. So think about when you're writing an essay, submitting for an academic paper, speaking to your boss at work, speaking to your professor. You speak in a certain formal tone that you don't usually speak to your friends in. So there's a lot of different things that shift your linguistic fingerprint that can make it really difficult in order to identify a certain person, speaker or author. This is still a very good method, however, when we have a large set of training data to identify a certain speaker. So here's another case study where we used forensic linguistics in a criminal investigation case. In this case, we used it to identify a certain author, in this case, a massive manifesto by the Unabomber. It was sent to a linguist who was able to give a large amount of demographic information about who the speaker likely was. This was then published to the media, and was identified by Ted Kaczynski's brother, who recognized how the linguistic mannerisms of his brother. So Ted Kaczynski, who was, I'm not sure if he was about 50 years old, I don't remember, but he had a PhD in mathematics, he was very well educated, and he was raised in Chicago but moved to California in his 20s, much like the linguist had accurately predicted. So what is another example in which we would use forensic linguistics? One such thing is copyright infringement. So we could take, say, a passage from a book or a line from a song, and we could look at two different publications or recordings and see just how similar they are to one another using forensic linguistics. And then there's also transcription. Figuring out what was most likely said in a noisily taped conversation. We can use things like stylometry, syllables to accurately transcribe text into a written form from a recording of spoken speech. So we can see an example here of how we would use syllables and stress in order to determine what was most likely being said in a recording. And we can see how this is very important, given that this is a court case, I believe, but transcription does truly need to be very accurate. And if we're going to automatically transcribe it, some linguistic analysis is necessary in order to make sure that we are most accurately transcribing that recording. The next application of forensic linguistics that we're going to be discussing is text classification. This is when you group certain texts or certain utterances into user-defined classes of utterances. So for example, say positive or negative tweets or reviews, and we'll go into more detail in these upcoming slides. So here are some examples of the applicability of text classification. You can use it to extract certain information. You can use it to determine genuine emails that need to go to your inbox and spam emails that are scams or just trying to get your money or something that you're not even interested in. And then there's also more industry-specific things such as social media or review analysis, so positive, negative reviews, health records, financial, and then legal analyses. Very, very important stuff. So here's going into more detail about teaching a machine how to classify certain texts using some of the stylometry that we mentioned, but for a computer. You know, a computer doesn't understand language the way that humans do, and so we need to be able to teach it how to do such things. This example of that applicability is for spam versus non-spam emails. So we need to teach the computer certain language or certain features of language that are more likely to be used in a spam email versus what's more likely to be used in a non-spam email. From there, the machine will then classify certain emails into spam or non-spam. These are the user-defined classes that I was mentioning earlier. This brings us back into document or text classification. We sort these documents or texts into user-defined classes, like I mentioned earlier, spam versus non-spam, positive versus negative, this author or that author, etc., etc. And this can be used for things like author identification or plagiarism detection or even forensic evidence for our criminal investigations, and so much more. While it's not foolproof, it is tremendously helpful to automate these sorts of practices or simply to use linguistic analysis in order to identify a speaker. So what is sentiment analysis that I mentioned earlier? This really looks into the semantics of each word and looks at the values of meaning each word presupposes. So for example, the word happy usually presupposes a positive meaning behind it. And things like horrible usually presuppose something negative associated with them. And there's so much more applicability that we'll go into in these next few slides. First and foremost, before we make a computer do anything, we have to give it a supervised learning set. We give the computer a training set of examples that we have already classified into certain groups. From there, the machine is able to learn what is good and what is bad, or what has this label and what has this label, what fits into this user-defined class and what fits into this user-defined class. This is measured in a test set. The machine is then tested to make sure that it does understand the difference between these words and the sentiment analysis that the users want it to be able to perform. From there, we are able to apply it to real-life case studies. So our examples in these next few slides are going to be reviews for the movie Pearl Harbor. And we're going to look at what we would most likely say about these reviews and maybe the problems that a computer may have with these if we're not very careful giving our computers a training set before applying them to real uses. So this first review is ridiculous movie, worst movie I've ever seen in my entire life. This, we could say, from a native speaker's perspective, is a very negative review. Ridiculous, worst. These are all very negative words with a very negative sentiment behind them. And so we'd look at the features of this word here, or of this review, and we'd say, oh, okay, words like ridiculous or worst. In my entire life, maybe, would be considered more on the negative side. These are more likely to be negative reviews. We put that into the training data. Next is another review, one of my favorite movies. It's a bit on the lengthy side, sure, but it's made up of a really great cast, which, for me, just brings it all together. So, this one, as native speakers, we would likely perceive this as a positive review. Some of the features that we might want to put into our training set for this positive review is favorite, really great, Words like that really show us the positive side of the review. Maybe if we said lengthy, we could associate that with a negative comment or a negative sentiment. But overall, this comment is very positive, and we would put that into our training set as a positive, into our positive review class that we've defined for our computer. So here we get into some more complex reviews. So the film is not as painful as a blow to the head, but it will cost you up to $10 and it takes 3 hours. The first hour and 45 minutes establishes one of the most banal love triangles ever put to film. Childhood friends, Rafe McCauley and Danny Walker, Ben Affleck and Josh Hartnett, both find themselves in love with the same woman, Evelyn Johnson, Kate Beckinsale. And then that's the source for the critique. This we'd probably consider a negative review. So let's look at some of our words that we would put into our training set in order to identify a positive or negative review. So we'd send this to the computer. Painful, or maybe blow to the head as a phrase, is very negative. Will cost 3 hours. Banal, very negative associations here. However, it is very lengthy and it uses some words that aren't necessarily very sentiment rich. They're not words that we could say, other than the ones that I mentioned, they're not words that we would say are inherently negative or positive. So this one might be a little bit trickier for our computer going through and reviewing these things if we don't put in a large training data set. So let's look at a more difficult one. The Japanese sneak attack on Pearl Harbor that brought the United States into World War II has inspired a splendid movie full of vivid performances and unforgettable scenes. A movie that uses the coming of war as a backdrop for individual stories of love, ambition, heroism, and betrayal. The name of that movie is From Here to Eternity. Okay, so this is a little bit more difficult because this is a review of Pearl Harbor, a completely different movie. So, as native speakers, we would look at this and say, okay, they're saying that From Here to Eternity is a better movie than Pearl Harbor. This is a negative review. However, it is extremely hard to put that into our computer data set in order for them to automatically identify or flag this as a negative review rather than a positive one. So let's look at some of the language that we would put into our training set. So inspired a splendid, vivid, unforgettable, love, ambition, very, very positive words. But that last sentence doesn't have any words with a specific positive or negative sentimental value, and yet puts the final nail in the coffin that dictates that this is a negative review. How do we put this into our data set? I'm not entirely sure. So, in order to train our computer, and make sure that it is accurate, we would do a test run on a certain set of reviews. So we would look at false positives and false negatives and see just how many there are, and determine how accurate our computer is from there. If it's not very accurate, we may have to go back and we may have to retrain or give it more data and then retry until we have a quality filter to distinguish between the positive and negative reviews, or whatever user-defined classes we have in whatever we are using machine learning for in sentiment analysis. So how do we train our computer to be more accurate in determining the positive or negative sentiment behind a review, or classifying text into any given user-defined classes that we would need? The answer is corpora, which a corpus is a collection of linguistic data, so say our training data of positive and negative reviews. That would be our corpus. Along with corpora is probability, and that we really have to incorporate into our computer learning as well. So rather than looking at the word, say, happy in all of these reviews and saying, happy is only used in a positive context, so therefore when I see the word happy in a review, I will mark it as a positive review. Instead of doing that, it will create a probability. Okay, it's the word happy is used this many times in a positive context, this many times in a negative context. And then when it sees the review, it will see the word happy and come back with a response of it is such and such more likely to be used in a positive context, or such and such more likely to be used in a negative context. And we would move forward from there with the additional data that we build for each word. Another application for forensic linguistics is author identification. So as mentioned when we were discussing the Federalist Papers, we would identify a certain speaker or author by using stylometry or certain linguistic tells, a linguistic fingerprint, their idiolect, in order to determine how likely a certain author or a certain speaker was to have written or spoken a certain utterance. Another application for author identification, which has a wide range of applicability, is author comparison. So in this example, we have 2 different authors and 4 different utterances. Our goal is to determine which author wrote what. So in this case, if we were giving this to a machine, we would have two user-defined classes, author1 and author2. So I'd like you to take a minute and look at some of these and guess which author wrote which utterances, author1 or author2. And then I will go ahead and I will show you the answers. So here are the results. We have Sir Arthur Conan Doyle in Sherlock Holmes in two different versions of two different short stories using very similar language. Then we have Jane Austen in the other two utterances. Did you guess it right? And if so, what features gave it away? We would use these features and apply them to a training set or a training set, and we would give that to our computer. From there, it would be able to read these, apply those features that we input into its training data, and with a certain level of accuracy, depending on how well we trained our computer, identify which author wrote which. So here are some of the features that were used for author identification in this case, or that could be used. So we have things like word choice, flowery, dated, content. Certain authors have different frequency of using certain words. So Jane Austen might use a certain word more often than Sir Arthur Conan Doyle would. Different types of punctuation, average length of words and sentences, and the syntactic structure of certain utterances all could give away how likely a certain text was to have been written by a certain author. Pretty cool, right? So one very important note to make when discussing machine learning relative to any form of processing human language is that computers do not understand language as humans understand language. For a computer, human language is simply variables that we are putting in with whatever value we associate with it. So when we give it to different classes, we say, here is a word, it has the value positive, or it has the value negative. It has the value 1, or it has the value 0. From there, the computer processes using probability and various mathematical functions in order to determine the most likely value of whatever word it is being given in order to identify certain texts, identify certain authors, classify certain documents, determine a certain sentiment of, say, a review, etc., etc. The best way to understand what this is known as the bag of words assumption. So the mentality would be to pretend that language is unstructured and simply a collection of words, and someone comes up to you and gives you a certain value for a certain word, and you pop back with, okay, if I see this in this text, then it means this, just based on the data that you're being presented. It's a bag of words. So from there, a computer would be given, or you in this case, would be given the task of determining between class Austen or class Doyle, given the data set that you've been assigned. You see a certain number of texts that are assigned the value Doyle. You see a certain value of texts that are assigned the value Austen. Rather than looking at language in the way that humans understand language, we look at our bag of words. We see that our data set for Doyle has certain types of words that are not as present or are less present in the data set for Austin. So here we can see things like authorship features. We see that the frequency of certain words is less than what they are in the opposing data set. This can be used by our computer or by you to better determine which author wrote what, or determine which text belongs to which user-defined class. An important note to make is on the state of machine learning and its features. So for machine learning models, they were required an indication known as feature engineering. A user manually inputs what features to notice, how to detect them, and this is fairly hard to automate. However, with deep learning or neural networks or AI, a user does not need to put in features. Instead, it will throw in lots of training data. The machine will then figure out the weighted features and then hand its results back to the user. This does have its consequences, and it is not entirely accurate, which is why these sorts of indications are shown using probability rather than statements of fact, rather than a computer saying, this is a positive review or this is a negative review. The computer would instead say, this is more likely to be a positive review, or this is more likely to be a negative review by this amount of probability. And we will see that in the next case on the next slide. The last application for forensic linguistics that I'm going to be showing you today is in plagiarism detection. This is heavily associated with what we talked about earlier with author identification and with the probability that I mentioned in the previous slide. So let's quickly take a look at what plagiarism is and what it is not. Plagiarism falls under the category of text reuse. Text reuse is the intentional or unintentional use of a text that already exists in order to create something new. Plagiarism is one kind of text reuse, but not all text reuse is plagiarism, and we'll get into that in some further slides. So how does a computer detect plagiarism? In this case, it differs between whether you're looking for plagiarism within a single text or whether you're looking across multiple texts. So within a single text, you would look for inconsistencies between the idiolects of the speaker. So you would look to see whether a quote does not fit in, either syntactically or lexically. Maybe the speaker is using a phrase structure that they don't tend to use through the rest of the text. Or maybe they're using bigger words that you haven't seen them use through the text, etc., etc. And then find sources for these inconsistencies. Next is the detection across multiple texts. So you would look and see whether the speaker uses the same or similar mannerisms to another text within your data set. So you would identify either unacceptable collaborations, which are very similar or reference a certain text without directly citing them, or you identify direct copying without the appropriate credit. This is where we get more into the probability method, which I mentioned earlier. The theory when it comes to plagiarism and detecting plagiarism is that the more similar two texts are, the more likely that one is plagiarized or derived from the other. Some possible indicators include vocabulary use, word length, syllable structure, rhyme and grammar, and so much more. Indicators use red flags for later human inspection because this isn't a foolproof method. It should also be mentioned that similarity does not equal plagiarism. That is why it's so necessary for a human to go back and double check because this is not a foolproof method. Here we have an example from Turnitin, which uses plagiarism detection software and flags certain utterances which may be plagiarized for professor review. Here we can see that the probability is very low that it was plagiarized, but it's flagged for human review just in case this was unintentional or is simply a similarity in words. Professors will go through this and make sure that you aren't falsely flagged, and will make sure whether or not you did or did not plagiarize your work. The important thing to see here, though, is that rather than turn it in saying that this utterance was or was not plagiarized, it says this was 4% or 12% likely to have been plagiarized from another source. From there, it is flagged for review, and the human can then determine. This shows that this is not a foolproof method and still requires some human intervention. That being said, that is the end of our lesson on forensic linguistics. Be sure to watch the rest of the videos. They go into depth about some of the topics that I couldn't spend a lot of time on in this video, and many other applications for how forensic linguistics can be used with computers and how we can automate certain forensic linguistic concepts. That being said, make sure to watch all the other videos, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on Friday.